Shabbat shalom, everyone. So I was going to talk about something, and then I had a conversation with somebody, and now I'm talking about something entirely else. So you can blame that person whose name I'm going to mention very shortly. But there's actually two things I want to talk about, two very brief ideas, but I think they have some traction to them. The first thing, we want to welcome Joe Alul back from his trip to Morocco. He told me, he shared with me outside in the hallway a story that I want to share with you. And if I make an error in retelling the story, please don't correct me. Just afterwards at Kiddush, you can point out what I said wrong. So Joe told me that he was going to visit some of the cemetery of his relatives in Marrakesh. And when he approached closer to the Jewish cemetery in Marrakesh, he encountered something quite unusual and remarkable. To give context and some color to the circumstances that Joe encountered there, it's probably important for us to rewind the tape a little bit and think about a little bit of history. And that is, the Jewish story in Morocco is hundreds of years old. Now, let's put a conservative figure on it and say that the Jewish story of Morocco is about 700 years old. By extension, if you were to translate that for European Jews, the story of Jews in Poland is about 900 years. The story of Jews in Germany, depending who you ask, about 1,200 years. Some say 1,700 years. So the story of Jews in Morocco is really, really old. Now, the story of the Jews in Morocco is painted in an even deeper context when we realize where they came from. By and large, the great Jewish communities of Morocco were the descendants of people who were evading religious persecution in Spain. And this is before the Spanish Inquisition. Much of what we know and understand about the Inquisition is wrong, by the way. But 1492 was not the day that the Jews picked up and left Spain. They left long before, segments of them, and they went in two directions. There are those who went north. And by north, what am I referring to? By north, I am referring to, in particular, Amsterdam. And then from Amsterdam, many of those Jews went to what was then known as the New World. That's why some of the oldest synagogues in North America are Spanish, Portuguese congregations. In North America, particularly in the United States, of course, that the reason why the Spanish, Portuguese transplanted Jews into Amsterdam and Dutch lands, then went to New York in particular, was because before it was New York, after the Battle of Wall Street against the British, it was known as New Amsterdam. And it was a Dutch colony, and the Jews went there. And so the story of the Spanish Portuguese Jews, on one direction they went north, and then in another direction they went south. Across the Iberian Peninsula, they made their way to northern Africa. The great Jewish communities of Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and then they migrated even further east back to Egypt, is the story of for lack of a better term, the storm that blew its way after the Jews picked up and left Spain. To be fair, many of them, a large number of Jews did not leave Spain, and that is a story for an entirely different morning. And so the Jews lived there, as I said, for hundreds and hundreds of years, cultivating an enormous culture and history and story. The imprint of Northern African Jews is both in its context of language and philosophy and scholarship is immense, immense. And then in 1948, with the founding of the State of Israel, pogroms, to use the European Jewish word, exploded all over the Arab lands against the Jewish communities. The first one erupted, to my knowledge, in Iraq, in Baghdad, but then it spread quickly all throughout the Arab Jewish world, and the Arab Jews were faced with the question of questions, which is always for Jews, where to go. Many of them went to Israel. Many of them went to North America. But the story in 1948 essentially was the end of the story of the indigenous Arab Jews. So anyways, Joe makes his way to Marrakesh. And how often do you go to Morocco, Joe?
Every 2 years.
Every 2 years. And you make your way to Marrakesh because that's where your family graves are. You visit your parents, I assume, and other family members. And he makes his way into the cemetery, and immediately he is presented with security guards. And they ask him what he is doing there. At the same time, Joe is also privy to hearing music. And he sees flags. And shortly thereafter, he realizes that those flags are Israeli flags. The music that he is hearing is the sounds, the musical notes of the Hatikva, which is the national anthem of the State of Israel. And the security guards, presumably were the Israeli security detail that were there. And they asked him the question of questions, why are you here? And Joe answered them, honestly, I'm here to visit my family. And why was that all happening? Because one of the senior ministers in the Israeli government, his name was Gideon Sar, he was in Morocco making an official visit on behalf of the Israeli government. And he was given, and by no means is this an exaggeration because it was all over the news this past week, he was given a king's welcome. As Joe shared with me, all throughout the major cities of Morocco, Marrakesh, Casablanca, that there were Israeli flags everywhere. On the Israeli embassy in Morocco, Joe explained to me that the size of the Israeli flag is like the size of the half of the wall in the lobby outside of this small chapel here. He said that everyone, I'm talking about the Moroccan Arabs, were saying, Baruchim Habayim. Joe confessed that many of them speak better Hebrew than he does. And what a remarkable change. Remarkable change. But the small thought I wanted to share with you with this brief story that Joe had confided with me is that the size of the Israeli flag in Casablanca and Marrakesh is enormous. I would ask you, try to find the Israeli flag over the Israeli consulate on Bloor Street. Try, for example, to go to any European city and try to find the Israeli embassy by looking at the flag. There is something very twisting happening. The presumptions of where values align and where values don't align, and the presumptions we make about what those kinds of values are. But sometimes we only realize the extent of how much our world has changed is by only realizing in hindsight how different things currently are. And so, Joe, that's the thought that came to me when I heard your story. The last thing I wanted to share with you was a small item at the very end of the Torah portion. For the record, most scholars, and an Israeli biblical scholar by the name of Moshe Shavid wrote a groundbreaking book on this about 20-something years ago. He argued forcibly, and I think also conclusively, that if you look at the data, you realize that for all intents and purposes, the last words that Jeff read for us from the Torah portion this morning, which were the concluding words of the fourth book of the Torah, that being 4 of 5, that for all intents and purposes in ancient biblical history, that was the concluding words of the Torah. The fifth book, the book of Deuteronomy, has an entirely different story to it, which we will get to next week. And so the concluding final words tell us that the Israelites were there on the banks of the Jordan River, about to enter into the Promised Land. You can see it yourself. The words are right there. But just before then, we read something so interesting. It's the story of what's called Benot Tzalafchad, the daughters of Tzalafchad. And what they argue is in approaching Moses was for a change in one of the inheritance laws. The biblical law to that point had been that only sons could inherit the lands of their fathers, thus leaving the question, what would happen if a person had no sons? It would then go back into the ancestral pool. It would not be left to the daughters. And so the daughters of Tzalafchad make an appeal to Moses. And what does Moses do? He changes the law. It is, for all intents and purposes, one of the great strokes of, I think, the reason why we call Moses Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi, because it was a great rabbinical moment. You don't look at what's written. You look at what needs to be written. When I looked at that, I realized something else. I realized that by and large, over the many years of my education and my rabbinic training and all of my studies thereafter, I realized that any time, most of the time when I quote something, it was always written by a man. And when you look at the long history and chain of rabbinic history for hundreds, if not thousands of years, by and large, we always quote other men. But it's interesting to note that one of these outstanding moments in the biblical record is clear in stating where we hear the voice of women. And over the past 50, 60 years, we've heard more voices of women. And that's a very, very needed thing. Because just one item I'll point out to you, and that is, just a few weeks ago, you all, I know, remember of the enormous controversy and feelings after in the United States, they reversed Roe v. Wade. And then I stood up here and I gave you for 15 or 17 minutes this bit of a thought about how Judaism thinks about abortion. And I showed you all the different sides of the question. And then when I got off the bima, and then that afternoon, I said to myself, it's interesting that all the people that I quoted, all the rabbinic authorities who in fact stated that women do have choice over their own bodies, and that there are provocative reasons why, of course, that we argue that life does not begin in conception, and that the mother's health and well-being, both psychological and physical, always take precedence over the fetus. And the people that I quoted were rabbinic authorities, both of Talmudic, ancient, and modern times. But the one thing I didn't quote was the voice of a woman saying that. And that the woman's voice over the past 50 and 60 years is something that we have begun to be hearing in Judaism, and it's one that we shall continue to hear with greater and greater volume, not just in the liberal Jewish world, but trust me when I say, in the observant Orthodox world as well. They are speaking, and they are being heard, and it should only continue. Shabbat Shalom.